Welcome everyone. For the benefit of the recording, we're at the University of Leeds in front of an invited audience who study Israeli politics, Israeli history, the Israel-Palestine conflict, the history of the Israel-Arab conflict. So we've got a thoughtful invited audience. I'm Dr. Alan Craig, and I am very delighted to be able to bring to you today, by invitation, Mark Regev, the Ambassador of the State of Israel to the UK. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, what's happening today is that I'm going to have a conversation with the Ambassador. I'm going to try and raise some issues and raise some subjects and see if I can tease out of the Ambassador something that he hasn't said already, or some insights that are going to enrich our studies and our understanding of the region. So there are issues to do with Israel, there are issues to do with Israel's relationship with the rest of the world, there are issues to do with Israel-Palestine, and there are regional issues, all of which we have the opportunity to explore today. If I can begin, how would you like to be addressed? Mr. Ambassador?
Mark.
Mark. Well, there you are, you see. This is the state of Israel. This is not Whitehall. So, Mark, looking at your bio, you are not born and brought up in Israel. You spent your childhood in Melbourne in Australia. So, growing up in Melbourne in Australia, how did your family come to be in Melbourne in the first place?
My mother's family were Polish Jews who decided that there wasn't a future for Poland in the 1920s. And there's this story of my grandfather being on a train from Warsaw to Berlin, I think in 1921 or 22. He was studying engineering in Germany, and he read in a German newspaper that Australia is the country of the future. And he went back to Poland, and the four brothers went to Australia and emigrated in the late 20s. And I presume had they not emigrated, they would have been like most other Polish Jews, they would have been murdered in the Holocaust.
So,
can I just finish the question of my father's family? My father is a German Jew, and he actually was stuck in Europe during those difficult years. And his family emigrated to Australia in 1949. So on both sides of my family, I suppose you would say my mother's side are just immigrants, and you'd say my father's side were refugees.
How did your father's family survive?
Very complicated story, but the end of it is clear. All students of history know that there is a certain amount of academic and other discussion about Bomber Harris and the bombing campaign of German cities. My father says Bomber Harris saved his life because they were in a precarious situation in the city of Magdeburg. And the RAF bombed the place, and in the smoke and in the confusion, in the chaos following the attack, they escaped to the countryside where they were in hiding until liberation.
So were they in hiding in Magdeburg at the time?
No, there were Jews in Magdeburg at the time. My grandfather was a slave labourer.
So from slave labourer to ambassador?
I was not a slave labourer. But my grandfather was a slave labourer, correct.
Yeah. So I'm asking this because you are right, I think, in your depiction, that we all see and we all think of Australia as a fantastic place to be. Who wouldn't want to visit Bondi Beach? Who wouldn't want to grow up in Melbourne? Who wouldn't want to go down to the coast at the weekends? Must have been a fantastic place for your family to arrive. I've been to Melbourne. It's like Manchester by the sea, but with better climate. It's a great place. So Why? Why leave Melbourne and go to Israel? You've got a Jewish community. What was the Jewish community like in Melbourne when you were a child?
It's probably very different today. When I was a child, I think a lot of my peers had parents who were also what was euphemistically called post-war refugees, or post-war immigrants, they used to call them in Australia.
So they didn't call them survivors?
They didn't call them survivors. No one talked about the Holocaust then. Maybe because it was too... My father never talked about it, never. When he got older, we would ask him, and maybe he would talk about it. But no, it was never... It was always, I suppose, psychologically it was there, but never talked about. But I have no doubt that it affected my family, and it affected me. There's all these psychological theories about the children of Holocaust survivors, which I am in no position to judge because I never studied psychology. No. And you're not allowed to psychoanalyze yourself anyway, correct?
Well, only the psychologists psychoanalyze themselves, which is why many of them go into that profession, but that's a whole other issue. It's interesting because this is something that we think about on the course when we look at Israeli politics, Israeli society, we look at Israeli reactions to the Holocaust and the story of the nation. And many people say it's hard to understand this on a group level. You know, this is a very personal thing. Psychology is personal. So you grew up in Melbourne, as you were saying, among many people who had arrived there in the same sort of way as you. And so how did that impact on your childhood? How did this lead to a decision to pack up your bags, presumably leave your family behind and travel to the state of Israel?
Well, first of all, there was a precedent. My parents left Australia in 53, 54 and went to live in Israel. They were on a kibbutz in what used to be called the Jerusalem Corridor, Kibbutz Tzorah. They were there for a year and a bit, and then they came back to Australia. The family folklore is my mother loved the kibbutz, and my father said it reminded him of a DP camp. You know, with yes. Food and rationing. DP is displaced persons, like what people used to call refugees.
And Israel in the 50s was a tough place to be.
Definitely there was rationing and so forth. Before I made a decision to go and live in Israel, both my older sisters were living there. And so it was a natural family progression. But I became, at about of age 16, I started getting very interested in politics, and I joined a Zionist youth movement.
Haponim.
Correct. And that took me to Israel for a year when I finished high school, and I decided that I wanted to live there.
Haponim is well, it certainly was at the time, a socialist Zionist youth movement. Was there a socialist element in this at the time?
Definitely.
Did that appeal to you?
Of course.
So that when you went off to Israel as this Habonimnik to Israel, to a kibbutz, I think you went to?
Mm-hmm. So that was the whole idea at the time, that the kibbutz, to use Marxist terms, the kibbutz represented the synthesis between Zionism and socialism. It was the fulfillment of an ideological vision. That's how it was seen at the time. And I, at the age of 18, 19, took it very seriously.
So at that age, you were attracted to the Marxist, socialist, agrarian synthesis. But weren't you arriving a little bit late to the kibbutz experience? Hadn't the
wife
kibbutzim already decided that that wasn't for them?
Correct. My wife would tell you that it took me a while to wake up. She was born on a kibbutz, and so she grew up in collective education and so forth, and she is very critical. And it's true.
So just for others, if you explain what a kibbutz collective education might have looked like in the 1950s.
So after, I think, 3 months, a baby is transferred to the collective children's house, or baby's house in this situation. Kindergarten. And obviously the mothers come to nurse when they need to nurse, but the idea was to, you can think about this retrospectively, rightly or wrongly, or what was it based upon, but the idea was to give equality to the woman. And so someone would look after her children, And then she could be in the fields or in any job that she chose to be, and it was the socialist idea.
What was it like for the baby?
My wife says it was traumatic. And she's not the only woman or man who grew up in a kibbutz framework that is very self-critical, though there are some people who said it was the best education they ever had.
But by the time you got there, all of this was becoming a thing of the past, I suspect.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
They were all dividing up the land and
Correct.
owning their bungalows.
No, that's later. That's
Okay.
in the 1990s.
Okay, so let's try and put a date on this. When are we talking about?
I come and live in Israel in 1982,
Okay.
and I stay on the kibbutz until 1989, 7 years.
So you lived quite a long time.
Yeah.
What did you do on the kibbutz?
I started off in agriculture.
What does that mean?
I worked in the avocado fields, then I worked in the banana fields. And then, because I had a degree, I went off to study to do a dip ed and a master's degree, and then I taught high school in the kibbutz high school for 2 years.
Okay, so you'd got a degree, I think, in international politics, international relations?
Political science.
Political science. You've got a degree in political science, you've got a political scientist and a practitioner wrapped into one. So you've got a political scientist who comes from Melbourne to Israel, imbued with this, I think, I'm getting some sort of idea of some sort of idealistic youth here, making a better go of it than the parents might have, from a socialist perspective, ends up working in the banana plantation until something takes you back. Was it the Hebrew University you go to, or was it the...
No, I finished army service in '84. And then I had a scholarship from the University of Melbourne to do a master's degree at the Hebrew University. So I went to the collective and I said, I've got this scholarship. Can I go study? Because you can't go and study by yourself without getting permission from the collective, although you have to leave the collective. And that's why I did the DIPED, the Diploma of Education, because the kibbutz said, you can go study, provided that it's useful for the collective, and so do a DIPED at the same time. That's why I got to the Hebrew University.
So this is kibbutz socialism in practice.
Correct.
You've got it all lined up to do the master's degree you want to do, and the kibbutz says that may be okay for the individual, but it's not okay for the collective.
Correct.
It's not going to help you with the bananas.
Correct. But to be fair, in distinction from collectives from the former Soviet bloc or other parts of the world, a kibbutz is a voluntary collective. No one is forcing you to be there. And so it's wrong to associate a kibbutz with some of the sort of more authoritarian collectives that one normally associates them to. It is a voluntary group of people who together decide, choose to live that way. And when I chose that it wasn't for me, I left.
Who decided first, you or your wife?
I don't know, it's a good one. I think you could say we decided together, but
Okay.
I think she was pretty sure that she wanted to leave.
Okay, so you leave, you do the studies. Do you go back to the collective and say, I've got the piece of paper now, I'm going to teach?
No, when I finished studying, I taught high school.
Okay, but not on the kibbutz, you'd left.
No, on a kibbutz high school.
On a kibbutz high school?
Yeah, I taught
I
kibbutz
see.
kids.
Right, so you're back there again.
That was, from the kibbutz point of view, that's like working in the bananas. It's working for the kibbutz. That was fine.
When you were studying, were you still on the kibbutz?
Yeah.
So you didn't go off to university, you stayed on the kibbutz, your day job was to work and learn the skills. When you'd learned the skills, you go back to the kibbutz and you use it to teach other people.
Correct.
You're paying your debt to the kibbutz.
Correct.
For how long?
Well, I got back from studying in '86, and I left the kibbutz in '89.
Okay. So you leave the kibbutz and you go into the '89 in Israel. You know, it's neoliberalism, it's the...
Shamir was prime minister.
Shamir was prime minister, tough right-wing prime minister. Your socialist, if you're going to get involved in that, your sort of socialist little veneer or depth is going to have to compromise a little bit, I would think.
Correct.
It's a tough environment, Israel, in the 1880s.
I think in the 1980s Israel is already
1980s, yes, sorry.
it's already changing from being an agrarian collective country to a much more Western European type country.
Well, when I say tough, I mean economically tough. I mean more neoliberal. I mean more competitive.
Oh, you mean that I had to look after myself?
Absolutely.
But I worked out on the kibbutz, so it wasn't a big change.
Okay, so the muscular Mark leaves the kibbutz and does what?
I started a doctorate at Tel Aviv University.
And this was your own choice. You didn't have to get any approval from anybody else.
No, it was my choice. Once you leave the kibbutz, you leave the kibbutz. Yeah. And to support myself, I got jobs teaching. I tutored first-year international relations students at the Tel Aviv University. I had a job teaching for the army, because the army used to have a program together with Tel Aviv University. There must be equivalents here with the British military, where army officers at the rank of captain or major, like junior officers can do a BA program through the army, so I tutored there as well. And I worked for Israel's Open University, which you should know, is modeled on the British Open University. Harold Wilson was a Labour Prime Minister here and a great friend of Israel, and the Israeli Minister of Education at the time was also a Labour politician, and he came to Britain and he brought the Open University to Israel so as to encourage working people who hadn't had a chance to go to university to be able to study in the evenings, and it was a very successful program. It's been a success story.
So this was Renana?
No, the Open University? No, they didn't have a huge campus back then. It was all over the country.
Okay. So what takes you into politics, because at some point you depart from this and you become a practitioner? I think you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
So I'd finished a year of studies at Tel Aviv University, and I did all the compulsory work that I needed to do for my doctorate. And then I reached the point where I had to sit down and write my thesis, and I just couldn't get excited about what I was writing about. On the contrary, I decided I took my master's thesis and I was going to expand it into a doctorate, and I looked at my master's thesis and I said, this is all rubbish. and
what was your master's thesis on?
We're going really into nuance here, yes?
Yes.
You want that?
Yeah, go on. I mean, we're all interested. You're about to tell us you abandoned your PhD, so, you know, what was it that didn't attract you?
So there was an Israeli politician that you know probably very well called Yigal Allon, who I mentioned a moment ago, who was one of the leaders of the Israeli labor movement. He was the leader of a certain wing of the Israeli labor movement. And he put in, after the '67 war, he put the Allon plan on the table, which was a plan for peace, supposedly. And
a corridor to Jordan.
Correct. And I said, oh, everyone's looked at the Allon plan. I'm going to look at the precedents of the Allon plan. I'm going to look what he said in the decade from 1957 to 1967 and try to find the roots of the Allon plan, because no one had written about that. And that's what I did my master's thesis on. And then I thought, maybe mistakenly, that I can expand this to a doctorate. But when I lost enthusiasm for my subject, I just couldn't do it. Maybe I lacked discipline, maybe I lacked a good professor. It's very easy always to blame someone else, isn't it?
Sure.
And there was this ad in the newspaper to take the entrance exam to the Israel Foreign Service. And I remember my wife saying to me, what do you got to lose? They accept 1 out of 50 people. They accepted me. And I've been in the Foreign Service of Israel since 1990.
With postings around the world?
Correct.
I think Shanghai?
Beijing.
Beijing. But this is your first job as an ambassador. But before that, at some point, between these various postings and accepting this job as ambassador, you were spokesperson in various roles for a long time.
The Foreign Service, I was a Foreign Service cadet until '91. In '91, they sent me to Hong Kong when it was still British. I was there from '91 to '93. Then I moved to Beijing from '93 to '96. Came back to Israel, worked in our division for Middle Eastern Affairs on the Jordanian division, and it was a very exciting time because it was the early years of the peace between Israel and Jordan. Then I went to Washington, and then I was a spokesman. I went to Washington in 1999, was the spokesman of the Embassy of Israel, came back after the end of my term and was spokesman of the Foreign Office of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then one day I got a phone call from the Prime Minister's office saying, would I like to work for the Prime Minister? And I was there for about nine years altogether.
Was this Benjamin Netanyahu throughout, or did it switch?
No, it was Olmert's office that asked me to come over in the beginning. Netanyahu kept me on the team.
Okay, so you worked for both?
Correct. For Olmert, it was probably a year and a half. It wasn't that long.
Okay, it's interesting to see this trajectory. So if you were calling yourself, or if you were thinking about yourself as an Australian Zionist, what would Zionism have meant for you then, and has it changed now? Or would you even have called yourself, or would you even have thought of yourself in those terms?
No, of course I would have thought of myself in those terms. Definitely I would have a self-declared Zionist, and still am today.
Okay.
So I see Zionism as the national movement of the Jewish people for freedom. The Jewish people were a persecuted minority for too many years. The Jewish people were victims of persecution and even genocide, as you know, as my own family experienced. And the idea that the Jewish people should be equal among the nations, that they too would have a state of their own and the ability to be sovereign and independent. I firmly believe that until today. I believed it then, I believe it today. I mean, if people look at how the world has treated Jews historically, yeah, I fail to understand how someone cannot support the essential justice in the Jewish people being independent, free and sovereign in their homeland.
So it wasn't just an idea of wanting to go onto a socialist kibbutz. This is motivating you to move from Australia to Israel.
Correct.
And it remains your driving principle.
Correct.
So you find yourself now as ambassador for the State of Israel, where I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that the proportion of people who would think of Zionism in negative terms rather than positive terms that you've espoused will be overwhelming. How do you cope with the fact that on the latest poll from the BBC in popularity of countries, Israel is down there between North Korea and Iran? How do you deal with this, with these sort of intense feelings of loyalty to the country and positivity? And how do you cope with this?
I see it in historic terms. I see people believed the most irrational things about Jewish people in history. They believed Jews were responsible for all sorts of terrible crimes. And I believe in many circles that Israel today is the Jew among the nations. In other words, people associate Israel, and justifiably, with many of the typical anti-Semitic stereotypes. I firmly believe that Israel, consciously or subconsciously, that people single out the Jewish state for subjective moral indignation that doesn't stand up to logical criticism.
So this is a form of discrimination writ large?
Correct. That's what I firmly believe. I'll give you an example, if I may. Let's say you have a colleague at this university who's called for a boycott of Israel.
Yep.
So I would ask, Israel has faults, Britain has faults, America has faults, France has faults. But we're a democracy, rule of law, independent judiciary. This professor who's called for a boycott of Israel, has he called for a boycott ever of Syrians' Assad?
No.
Or Gaddafi's Libya?
No.
Of other autocratic regimes in Asia?
No.
Africa?
No.
Latin America?
No.
So what is it about the Jewish state that this moral indignation, what's that all about? It's not rational.
Well, I'll introduce you to him later if you like.
Happy to.
But I'm not going to, I'm going to leave it to the questions. There are many different points of view about the nature of Israel, which we can leave to the question and answer. I'm not going to put his points for him. Yeah, but how important is this? I mean, famously, Ben-Gurion, father of the State of Israel, in his political maneuverings, in his political arguments with Moshe Sharet, famously said words to the effect of, "It doesn't matter what the Goyim think, what matters is what Israel does." Roughly translated means, it doesn't matter what the rest of the world think of us, what matters is what we do ourselves. What matters is Israeli action, not public opinion. Can you actually run a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an approach to the outside world on that basis?
There was a book that I used to tutor with, but we're going back 30 years and you will remind me the book. It was for International Relations 101, Power Among Nations with an M. What's the name of the author? Thank you. Who said that? I'm impressed.
Hans Morgenthau.
Correct.
Yeah,
well done.
A German Jew who ended up in the United States and created realism and the study of international relations. And James Worrell will actually tell you all about it if necessary.
Good. But thank you for reminding me. It's been a while. Morgenthau talks about power among nations. It's wrong to see power only in the form of the strength of your economy. If I get it wrong, you'll tell me. Or the number of tanks you have. But power is also a function of ideas and moral force. And my country is strong. And I'm thankful that my country is strong because, to be very frank, my country wouldn't exist if it wasn't strong because we are in a hostile, have been in a hostile neighborhood. But what nations think is part of that Morgenthau, it's part of also power. It's very important.
So what came to be called soft power, or what now comes to be called international legitimacy, and what now comes to be important, particularly with the growth of international society, international criminal courts, UN, and all the rest of it. So you take this seriously?
Of course.
What if... Oh, let me just think about this for the moment. When people look at the behavior of Israel, people see Israel particularly through the lens of Israel's behavior towards relations with the Palestinians. Israel and the Palestinians are in this inseparable clinch. And students here will have lived through and noticed the last 4 wars in Gaza. Will have noted...
3.
Depends what you want to call a war.
Okay.
How can you defend a policy that results in Gaza becoming what many call a humanitarian catastrophe? Is this not the response, is this not, at least to some extent, a failure of Israeli policy?
First of all, I agree it's a failure of policy. But let's look exactly what happened with Gaza, because there's a lot, I believe, that can be learned from the Gaza experience. For many years, people in Europe said to Israel, you people don't just get it, you don't understand. Go back to the 67 lines, take down the settlements, and everything will be fine. That was said over and over again by officials and editorials. The Israelis don't understand what's in their own best interest. They should understand it's in their interest to go back to the 67 lines and take down all the settlements. And guess what we did in Gaza 10 years ago? We took the advice of accepted international conventional wisdom. It's like we took an editorial from one of Britain's leading newspapers and we transformed it into government policy. We went back to the 67 lines. No one doubts that, no one argues with that. The border between Israel and Gaza is the 67 line. And we took down all the settlements. And the settlers who didn't want to voluntarily leave, we forcibly pulled them out, arresting them and making sure that they had to leave. And so I do believe from the experience in Gaza, is extremely important to understand the failures of the peace process, is to understand what happened in Gaza. And I would ask the following question. I agree that Gaza is a tragedy, but is Israel responsible for that tragedy? We pulled out, we took down all the settlements, and it didn't work according to the way it was supposed to work. And then people say to us, but you have to do the same thing on the West Bank, correct? Israel is expected to take down all the settlements and pull back to the 67 line, and then everything will be fine. So I would ask, I think I am allowed to ask, explain to me how it's going to be different.
Well, maybe it could be done better.
So we should have changed the tactics a little bit. I think that's avoiding the essential point, though.
Well, maybe you should have, you should have brought yourself, maybe Ariel Sharon should have brought himself to do the impossible at the time, which was actually to speak to Arafat, to actually negotiate this, to assist in the building up and the installation of Fatah in Gaza, rather than pulling out.
So I would remind you, at the time, it was already Abu Mazen, and they were speaking, and there was a coordinated effort supported by the international community to lend tangible assistance to the pullout. There was a meeting in Scotland a few months before the Israeli pullout of the, I think at the time it's the G7, I don't remember if it's already the G8, and they promised all a massive investment into the Gaza economy. In other words, we were pulling out, the international community was going to go in with vast sums of money, and there was supposed to be a disengagement dividend. It's not like, there was an agreement signed between us and the Americans and the Palestinians on access, movement and access. Condoleezza Rice, I remember, was running back and forth between my government and the Palestinians. It wasn't supposed to be. To say that Israel just pulled out, no, there was a whole international framework and decisions were made and support was given and the UN supported us. But when it doesn't work out, it's Israel's fault, of course.
There are many among the Israeli security establishment, particularly the retired ones and some of those who are prepared to speak, who say that it's in Israel's interest to assist in the building of a seaport, of opening up sea access to Gaza, and to reduce the restraint on the Gaza economy and Gaza access. Why doesn't Israel do it?
We are considering all sorts of ideas to see what can be done. That particular idea, it's not just people outside government. I believe my Minister of Transport, who's a member of the Security Cabinet, has put a plan on the table for an artificial island off the coast of Gaza.
Yeah, perhaps if you can just explain that, because that is interesting.
Look, our problem is not that we don't have flow in and out of Gaza of goods and foodstuffs, medicine, and everything that the people there need. We don't have a problem with that. We do have a problem with a Hamas regime that wants to import rockets, because those rockets are ultimately shot at Israeli civilians. And so we've got to have, in the framework of trying to open the borders with Gaza as much as possible, you've got to have a security envelope. As long as Hamas is committed to its policy of terrorism and targeting Israeli civilians, it's clear that we are entitled, under international law, the UN said so, to keep that security envelope. And in the framework of that security envelope, how much can you open it up to allow access in and out of produce and so forth? And so my transportation minister says, let's build this artificial island where there'll be a security mechanism just off the shore of Gaza, but not in Gaza, for obvious reasons. Ships can come there with all their produce, knock it off, and it goes straight to Gaza, and there'll be some very efficient system of inspection. It's an idea. At the moment, we haven't moved to fruition. There are all sorts of economic challenges and security challenges. On the borders, there are a number of crossings open with Gaza. They are pretty much today at maximum capacity of trucks going in with foodstuffs, medicine, anything. There are no restrictions on civilian produce going into Gaza.
Okay, well, I'm sure we're going to have questions on that, so I'll leave that to questions. I think I noticed this week that the Russian foreign minister came to visit Israel.
Defense
Minister.
Correct.
And met the Israeli foreign minister.
No. Well, yes, it's true. He met
Lieberman,
Lieberman, the Israeli defense minister,
yes.
And he also met Netanyahu.
Yes. And this is following on from a very recent visit of Netanyahu to Russia as well.
Correct.
Clearly, the consideration is Syria. Clearly, the arrangements in which Russia is quite literally calling the shots in Syria at the moment. What is it that Israel wants from Russia in terms of Israel's room to maneuver in Syria?
So the first thing, and this happened still when I was at my previous job, I remember it in 2015, I think it was September, October 2015, the Russians suddenly very much upgraded their presence in Syria. And within days, my Prime Minister went to Moscow for a meeting with Mr. Putin. And the first overriding concern on the Israeli side, if the Russian military is going to be very active just north of us, how do we make a situation where we don't run into each other? You know, there was an incident between a Turkish...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that was not good for Turkish-Russian relations. And we, those of us who are old enough to remember, know that in the 1970s there were Israeli pilots shooting down Russian pilots over the Suez Canal. We didn't want to go back there. And we wanted to see if it was possible to establish channels of communication, tactical channels of communication, to prevent a situation where Israeli and Russian forces would shoot at each other.
But this would only happen if Israeli forces were actually in Syria or Lebanon.
They are now and then.
Yeah, so perhaps you can explain.
We've stayed out of the Syrian civil war for obvious reasons. We've offered humanitarian support to Syrian civilians, but we have not been involved in the shooting war between the two sides. That's a different question. You can ask me that if you're interested. We have said, however, that we have interests, vital national security interests, that we cannot ignore. And they are basically this: we won't allow Hezbollah to establish itself on Israel's border with Syria, so we'll have a private army there ready to attack us. We won't allow weapons that can change balances to go from Syria through to Lebanon, where Hezbollah is based. And we won't allow the Iranians to establish a presence along our borders. And we will do what needs to be done to achieve those objectives, which we consider are vital for our national security.
So if the Iranians aren't going to be on the Golan border, who is going to be on the Golan border?
Not Iranians.
Yeah.
But you're asking me, who do I prefer in the Syrian civil war?
Absolutely. Which group is Israel nurturing to occupy that space?
I think that's probably the wrong terminology. Look, how the Syrian civil war turns out, I don't know. The war should end. There's been too much suffering, too much pain, too much death. Though I would say, as a war of caution, all those people in the 1990s who said Israel should give up the Golan Heights, maybe Israel was right to be cautious, because if the Golan Heights would have been in Syria, that would have been a real problem for Israel, for our security. Look, we are confronted with a reality in the Syrian civil war which is extremely problematic. Because on one side you had a coalition that was dominated by Sunni Islamists, some very extreme like ISIS, other Muslim Brotherhood types, but neither of them particularly friendly towards my country. On the other side, you had a Ba'athist regime that was totally dependent on Iran. Assad would have fallen 2-3 years ago without Iranian support. So he was actually, in many ways, an Iranian satellite because he's become dependent on Hezbollah and Iran. There are no good choices for Israel in this. Who do we prefer? It's not an easy choice. So we've stayed out of it. Once again, we've offered humanitarian support to Syrian civilian population, and we've used our military when we've needed to in a very surgical manner in order to make sure that our national security interests have not been negatively affected as best we can.
What does that mean? All right, the Israeli Air Force, head of the Israeli Air Force a few months ago said publicly for the first time, and not according to foreign sources, I think he said there'd been over 400 Israeli missions by the Israeli Air Force in Syria. Is that something that Israel is now publicly accepting, or is this still remaining gossip?
I'm not sure gossip is the right word, but I cannot and will not officially confirm that number. I can only say that when Israel needs to act to protect vital national security interests, as other countries would act in a similar situation to defend their national security interests, we will act.
So this week Israel destroyed an anti-aircraft battery. Is that something that's been confirmed or not confirmed?
I'm not sure. But we wouldn't talk about that sort of thing publicly anyway.
Okay. Well, in that case, you're not going to do it here, which is fair enough. All right. There are other things that I wanted to talk about, not least of which are settlements, the regulation bill, the extent to which the current coalition is, I would say, being taken prisoner by the settler lobby. Changes in Israeli democracy in which you're making it an increasingly difficult place for NGOs to operate. But I'm not going to mention any of those things. I'm not even going to list them. I'm just simply flagging them up as possibilities for questions, not least of which the shift of Israeli politics to the right, to say nothing of the problems over religion, conversion, and all the rest of it are going on. So there are many other things to talk about, other than the things that we've covered in the conversation. But I think it is now time to actually throw this open to you guys. And what I'd like to do, and what I really want you to do, is ask questions. And we'll collect some questions, and Mark will answer them. And, I've tried to challenge Mark a little bit. He's taken it very well, and I'm sure he will from you as well. So, okay, questions. Can we have some questions? We've got one over here. Okay, to ask your question, it would be a good idea if you press your red button and then ask your question.
It's a two-part question. The first is that when I was in South Africa this summer, I read an article in one of the local papers, and there was a statement from the Nelson Mandela estate saying that there should be a boycott of a certain trip, I can't remember what it was supposed to be, of certain Israelis coming to South Africa, some kind of diplomats, I think, and in which the estate of Mandela wrote in a long letter that Israel is a brutal apartheid state, which disgusted me because it's factually incorrect, and to come from such a source was not nice. So could you possibly respond to that? And on the other side, could you possibly spell out for members of the audience who don't necessarily know some of the positive relations that are occurring between Israel, Palestine, Israel, Britain, and Israel and other countries, please?
I work on Hezbollah a great deal, and Alan's question about Russian and Israeli engagement is quite interesting, because to what extent do you really trust the Russians as good interlocutors in this? Because it seems from everything that I'm reading, the Hezbollah people I've spoken to, that they're learning a great deal from the Russian armed forces at the moment. And these are skills which will come in very handy the next time there's something happening on the northern border. How does Israel control for that?
Can you just share with us what you told me about your visit to the Hezbollah Museum? I think it's quite an interesting story.
Yeah, so last year I went to the Hezbollah's official kind of museum overlooking northern Israel, and when you go to the museum you're given a Hezbollah guide who takes you around. And in the main hall of the museum is the impression that Hezbollah wants to give you is that they know everything that there is to know about the Israeli armed forces. And so on the walls it lists the battle units of the Israeli army, it lists their current commanders, it lists their main bases, their main weapon systems, etc. And the entire hall is covered with this information, alongside a whole range of material that they've captured in previous combat with Israeli forces. They really want to get across this impression that they are essentially invincible. And very much when you talk to guys in Hezbollah nowadays, they increasingly feel that too. They really do seem to believe it. And this kind of interaction we've had with the Russians seems to be giving them a lot of confidence.
That your grandfather or your parents were Polish Jews, and you came to Melbourne, and then you immigrated or traveled to land of Israel. So I'm just wondering, how is that your right? You're not ever been born in Palestine, nor your parents, and you become from a family never been in Palestine or Israel, to go there, while a person who their grandfather and grandfather were in Palestine before 1948, way for hundreds of years, cannot enter Palestine just because they were displaced by the Haganah, paramilitary massacres in Palestine 48. This is the first question. And the second question was how the state of Israel would expect people to react while they're under the apartheid system, while Palestinians have their roads and Israeli have their roads, and multiple checkpoints from one city to another. And people are under siege in Gaza where they cannot eat sometimes. In 2014 war, let's call it a war, there were more than 2,000 people killed, civilians, most of them, children and women were killed in that war. How do you punish a whole population for, let's say, Hamas actions? Doctor, thank you.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I'll ask Mark to deal with them now, and then we'll have another round of questions afterwards.
I think your first question is extremely important, and it is the fundamental reason why there's a conflict. Because basically what you're saying, if I understood correctly, is that my country has no right to exist. That we have no right, I had no right to go live there, the Jewish people had no right to go live there, that Israel is an illegitimate creation, that we stole the land of Palestine and forcibly exiled the people who were living there. That's what I understood from your question.
More or less, but the thing is that because you're Jew, you were immigrated to Israel, while I know before 48, more or less, lots of our neighbors were Jews. That doesn't mean that they don't have the right to exist there, because we lived, Christian, Muslims, and Jews in the same land for years. But the thing is, because you're Jew, you could enter there. But while a Palestinian who descended from a Palestinian family now cannot enter there.
You see, I understand, and if I get it wrong, you will correct me. In other words, Jews, as they were a minority in Iraq and in Syria, they could have stayed to be a minority in Palestine, but they don't have the right to national self-determination. They don't have a right to independence and their own sovereignty. And I agree with you that this is the cause of the conflict. And it's very interesting, because many people say there's a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians because there's no Palestinian state. And I would argue that it's the opposite. The reason there is a conflict is because of the Jewish state. That there is a fundamental position amongst large parts of Palestinian society that Israel is illegitimate, that Israel is, to use language that the Palestinians would use, Israel is a creation of imperialism, it is illegitimate, it has no right to exist, that the Jews came and stole our land. Now, if this is a position, it doesn't matter how flexible I am on the issue of settlements, it doesn't matter how flexible I am on the issue of borders, it doesn't matter how flexible I am on the issue of settlement, of Jerusalem. If Israel is, in the eyes of some, fundamentally illegitimate, so we're not talking about a peace process, we're talking about a process to bring about the destruction of my country, and I will fight to defend my country. I would also add that if someone says the Palestinian people have a right to national self-determination, and the people of Iraq have a right to national self-determination, and of course the peoples of Africa and Asia have a right to national self-determination, but the Jews, the Jewish people, have no such right. They must be a minority, tolerated maybe, but to deny my people the right that you ask for your own people, what's that all about? And so I think your first question is extremely important, because I would argue that is the core of the conflict. My wife's family, you didn't ask me about my wife, you asked me about me. My wife's family, both her parents are from Aleppo in Syria. When I go to my mother-in-law for Friday night dinner, we eat, you'll laugh at me because I'll pronounce it wrong, mirchi, right? Which is this sweet and sour meat. How do I explain it? Jews lived in Aleppo since Babylonian times. Jews lived in Iraq since some of the oldest Jewish communities. They were tolerated, maybe. Often they faced persecution, but let's leave that aside. But the Jewish people wants independence and freedom and sovereignty. That is a right that you are denying my people, and I will not accept that. I'm willing for coexistence. I'm willing for peace. I'm willing for concessions. I'm willing for compromise. But if your position is that Israel has no right to exist as an independent country, then don't be surprised that I will fight to defend myself. If, however, we
come to the place that Israel is attacked, so we're now talking about peace, coexistence, which is now on the ground.
No, we're not. If Israel is... Sorry. If you say Israel is illegitimate, what peace are you offering me? Explain. If you say Israel is illegitimate, what peace...
When Israel was existed, it was illegitimate. And now forbidding people to come to their land, that's not right. That's wrong, according to all those in the world. I'm saying now that why my grandfathers cannot go to their land while you could. This is the thing.
So I would answer that question, but I think you avoided my major point, which was, if you say my country has no right to exist, that Israel is illegitimate in your eyes, you said so, therefore you're not offering me peace. You're saying, you must do this and this and this, you must stop doing this and this and this, and when you stop doing this, we will still try to destroy you. That's what I understand. If I got it wrong, you will explain it to me.
You got it wrong because now peace was offered several times by the...
So I want to deal with this point.
Yeah.
We will next year celebrate in Israel 70 years to my country's independence and sovereignty. And as you know, Professor, Independence Day in Israel is a national holiday and people do barbecues, and it's a day of very authentic celebration because only people who had fought for their independence know how to appreciate their independence. At the same time, Palestinians will commemorate what they call the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe. And I think I'm entitled to ask the following question. Why are Palestinians not celebrating 70 years of independence in parallel to Israel? Legitimate question. The United Nations in 1947 put on the table a two-state solution which said the land will be divided, there'll be a state for the Jews and a state for the Arabs, the Arab Palestinians. This was a UN decision, it had a two-thirds majority. My government embraced it. The Palestinian leadership said no. So why are we not celebrating 70 years to an independent Palestine? 50 years ago was the Six-Day War, the beginning of what you would call the occupation of the West Bank. What was the position of the Palestinians following the Six-Day War? It was the famous three no's of Khartoum. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. And I would argue, and this is what I said before, the real issue is the Jewish state. Is it legitimate in your eyes and the eyes of your fellow countrymen? Because the Palestinians, and I ask you to check my facts, we're being recorded, so anyone can check my facts. The Palestinians were offered statehood in 1937, and they rejected it. They were offered statehood again in 1939 with a British white paper. They rejected it. They were offered statehood again in 1947 by the United Nations. They rejected it. Because it was more important to destroy the Jewish state than to have Palestinian independence and sovereignty. And once again, it goes back to your very first question, which I agree is the core of the conflict, and I once again ask, and you don't have to answer, I'm being a rhetorical question, but if Israel is illegitimate in your eyes, if Israel is a criminal, imperialist creation, so it doesn't matter what I do. Until you destroy my country, there's no reason for me to... Now, I'm happy to say, and this is going into the second question, that today this is more and more a minority position in the Arab world. Your question, I believe. That today Israel is talking to more Arab governments than ever before in the history of the Jewish state. And that there's a growing acceptance in the Arab world that Israel is here to stay, and not only is Israel here to stay, that Israel is a partner. And you know, this year we mark 40 years to Israeli-Egyptian peace. We have, 2.5 decades of Israeli-Jordanian peace, and we are talking to more and more Arab governments. And it's very interesting, it's not that Arab governments suddenly woke up and decided they were Zionists. Yeah? More and more Arab elites see that there is a, what is the word? There is a convergence of interests between my country and theirs. For the sort of issue you raised, Professor, because of Hezbollah in Iran, because of ISIS. Many Arab governments, many Arab societies feel threatened by the forces of extremism, whether it's Sunni extremism as manifested by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Those governments would also include the Muslim Brotherhood in that framework. Or they feel threatened by Sunni extremism represented by Iran, Hezbollah, and so forth. And so Arab governments that were traditionally quite critical, if not hostile towards Israel, are today for the first time talking to Israel. I'm not talking about one country or two countries, I'm talking about countries across the Middle East. As I said, we are talking to more Arab governments than ever before, and this is optimistic. And how can this affect the Palestinian track? There's a famous story, the Camp David peace talks in 2000, where Arafat closed the door. When Arafat was said, why did you say no to Clinton? Why didn't you keep at it? Arafat said something, and I'm not quoting him directly, you'll find the exact quote, but the essence was, I couldn't have made the compromises, the Arab world would never have accepted it. Today, if the Arab world is more open to Israel and more open to a compromise, that's a significant change, a very significant change. And what we're working on at the moment, and we don't know if we're going to succeed yet, but the idea is that through the involvement of the Arab states in support of a process, we can relaunch the peace process. Now, it's not going to be easy. I'm under no illusions. But if the Arab states support a Palestinian-Israeli process of reconciliation, it has extra added strength. And that's very, very important. Ultimately, the Palestinians are an integral part of the Arab world. And if the dominant feeling in the Arab world is that Israel is a force in the region and is actually a force for good. If I can say something that needs to be said, many of the Arab governments base their national security on traditional friends in the West. Over the last 5 years, rightly or wrongly, in the minds of those Arab governments, traditional friends let them down, rightly or wrongly. Israel is part of the region. Israel is not going to become neo-isolationist because we're there, we're strong, and we are a good partner in the struggle against the extremists.
So what you're suggesting is that Israel is filling a little bit of a void left by the American boots on the ground.
You could say that.
These conversations that you're talking about are very much behind the scenes. None of this is going to be open until such time as Israel, and it is, as you say, very much conditional on the Palestinians.
But let's stop for a moment. It's behind the scenes, but you can see, it's like the iceberg, you see part of it above the water. Last Friday night, President Trump gave a speech about Iran. Agree, disagree, everyone can have their own opinion. There were two governments who came out the same night and publicly endorsed President Trump's position. One was my government, and the other one was the government of Saudi Arabia. That is a manifestation of the part of the iceberg that you can see. Shall I go to the other questions?
Yeah.
On Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a formidable threat. We fought a war with Hezbollah in 2006, and we ended that war with a ceasefire with the UN Resolution 1701, which said Hezbollah should be disarmed, and its Security Council voted, I think unanimously. And of course, in the last 11 years, the opposite has happened. Hezbollah is stronger. Hezbollah is a much, much more formidable enemy. Today, Hezbollah has many more missiles than it had in 2006. It has missiles with greater accuracy. It has missiles that can carry larger payloads, and they can go much deeper into Israel. And if you look at the 2006 war, they could hit the northern third of Israel from Haifa to Hadera. Today, Hezbollah can hit targets way deep into Israel. So first of all, when you ask Israelis why they are a bit cynical sometimes about UN resolutions, there's a prime example, okay? A resolution passed by the UN Security Council on the basis of which we achieved a ceasefire in Lebanon in 2006 said Hezbollah would be dismantled as a military force. The opposite has happened. It's also in many ways an oxymoron, maybe you know a better academic word, to say Hezbollah is a terrorist group. Because Hezbollah is stronger than the Lebanese state. All the experts know that. If there is ever a conflict between Hezbollah and the Lebanese army, we all know who has more fighting men and more equipment, and we know that Hezbollah, though we perceive it as a group of guerrillas with a few Kalashnikov and maybe a rocket or two, no. They have weapons, they have men, they're stronger than the Lebanese state. I would argue that the Hezbollah military machine is stronger than half the members of the United Nations. Maybe 2/3. Agree, Professor? So Hezbollah is a real threat, and Hezbollah, of course, as we know, doesn't believe in peace, doesn't believe in coexistence. If an Arab leader tomorrow makes peace with Israel, Hezbollah will consider them a traitor. The good news is, because of their involvement in Syria, Hezbollah, that in 2006 was the darling of the Arab world, or of the Arab street, as people used to say, today they are considered a foreign element paid for by the Iranians, which is pretty true. I have to tell you, it is our obligation as a government. We don't want another war in Lebanon, but we have to prepare for the fact that Hezbollah could start another round. We know that, and we know it will be difficult, but we know we will prevail and we will defeat Hezbollah. But you are 100% correct in pointing to the fact that Hezbollah is a formidable threat. But to get back to the point of your question, the threat of Iran and Hezbollah has brought us and the Arab states together, which is the positive side. You asked about the Russians specifically. So I was saying in an answer to an earlier question that we wanted a tactical dialogue with the Russians to make sure we wouldn't have mishaps and that we'd have some sort of situation of communication that would prevent us shooting down a Russian plane or they're shooting down one of ours. But we've also had conversations with the Russians on a more strategic framework. What is the long-term picture in Syria? And there we've made our positions to the Russians very, very, very clear. Our position is that in a post-conflict Syria, no Iran inside and no Hezbollah inside. Hezbollah is part of Iran. And we've made that very clear to the Russians. How it will play out, your assessment is probably more learned than mine. About the apartheid question. This is a vicious slur. I'm old enough to remember the anti-apartheid movement, and I remember the slogan of the anti-apartheid movement was "one man, one vote." Correct, Professor? One man, one vote. You couldn't say that today, that's politically incorrect. Today we would have to say one person, one vote. One man, one vote is sexist. But I'm proud to tell you I live in a country where we've had one man, one vote, or one citizen, one vote, or one person, one vote, since day one, since our first Knesset elections in 1949. In fact, Israel's Arab community, who are about 20% of our country, are the only Middle Eastern Arab community that has consistently enjoyed democratic rights over the last generation. I'm not saying there aren't social gaps in Israel. We have to act to narrow them. I'm not saying there aren't other issues. Of course there are. We have to act to overcome gaps where they exist. But no one can deny that Israel's Arab citizens are the only Arab community in the greater Middle East that has consistently enjoyed full democratic rights. Rule of law, independent courts, the right to vote in elections that actually matter, free press, freedom of expression, freedom of academic inquiry, and so forth. I would say the following, and I know I'm being Israeli and I'm not being totally objective, but when a Middle Eastern student, not here, somewhere else, comes to me and says, the problem with the Middle East is Israel, and they want to demonstrate against the Israeli ambassador or boycott Israeli products. If you are a Middle Easterner, if you're from Syria or from Iraq or from Lebanon or from Yemen or from Saudi Arabia, and you say the problem of the Middle East is Israel, guess what? It's a cop-out. It's a total and complete cop-out. You think of the crises going through the Middle East. Just look at the last few years since the failure of the Arab Spring. You don't have a single Arab country, maybe Tunisia is breaking the mold, we don't know yet, but you don't have a single Arab government which is democratically elected. You don't have a single Arab country where you have an independent judiciary. You don't have a single Arab country with a really free press. You have, what's the opposite of empowerment? You have the disempowerment of women across the region. And if someone from the Middle East comes to me and says, the problem of our region is the terrible Zionists, it's a bit like, Jews were the problem in Europe. It's a cop-out. It's running away from the real challenges these countries face. I believe that very firmly. I think I answered all the questions. And I'm happy to answer more if we have time.
We've got time. Just on the apartheid question and the question of vote. Your answer to that is to highlight the voting rights of the various minorities within Israel, including the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs of Israel. Full, absolute democratic rights. The issue that it's not so easy to address is the Palestinian Arabs living on the West Bank, who have been under Israeli control for the last 50 years, whose democratic rights do not extend because they're not citizens of the state, as we all know, and we wouldn't expect them to be, but their democratic rights are extremely limited. If Israel is going to continue control of the West Bank, what is going to happen about the apartheid analogy on the West Bank?
First of all, people living on the West Bank are voting and part of the Palestinian Authority's political process. You know, Professor, the West Bank is divided into area A, B, and C. Some are totally under Palestinian rule, some are under joint rule, and some are under Israeli rule. But all of them get to vote in Palestinian elections, and all of them get to participate in Palestinian politics. Now, the sad truth is that Palestinians who live under areas that have been vacated by Israel, which means Area A on the West Bank or Gaza, have less democratic rights than those under Israeli military occupation. That's the truth. They don't want to hear it, but it's the truth. Because there are no democratic rights in the Gaza Strip. Hamas rules in an authoritarian manner, don't tolerate independent opinion. And in Area A of the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority rules, I mean, just last week, I think, or the week before, you'll correct me, journalists were arrested, there's no free press, there are no free trade union movements, it's an authoritarian society. Now, those Palestinians, the minority of who live in Area A, which under the Oslo agreements is still under Israeli, even though they are under Israeli military occupation, they have the right to go to the Israeli courts. They have the right to judicial review, which means if you live in Ramallah and the government comes and says, we need to take over your house, you have no redress. The government will take over your house. Hope that you have a friend close to Abu Mazen. Maybe you can give a bribe or something, but there is no legal recourse. Palestinians on the West Bank, who are under Israeli control, do have that legal recourse. But then you get to the larger question, which is why doesn't Israel, if we really wanted to make it democratic, we would say, let's make them all part of Israel. Let's annex the West Bank. That's the position of the far right in Israel. That's the position of the people who don't believe that there should be a Palestinian state. That's the position of the people who believe it's all ours and let's keep it. We don't want that. We want to keep options open for a peace deal. We want to keep options open for a situation where the Palestinians can have their own self-government. And that's why we don't annex the West Bank. So on one hand, we are told you can't annex, right, by Israel's critics. And at the same time, we're told, and why don't they have right? You can't have it both ways. So the areas of the West Bank that are still under military occupation, that is unfortunately part of the reality and the framework of a peace process that has been stalled. I hope the peace process, as I said before, will restart again and we can find solutions. But annexing is not a solution.
Okay. Let's invite some more questions. Okay, good. We'll go around in this direction.
My question is, would you agree that maybe it's time for Israel to put behind the whole idea of Zionism in its politics, and I quote, now at a time where Israel is thought to be a good partner in the region? Or would you say that Zionism has still some part to play in Israeli politics?
Thank you for coming, Mr. Ambassador. As a fact, I am Kurdish from Iran. And again, as a fact, I remember a few places in my own city, Saqqara program, that is landmark is saying this is public baths for Jewish, that one is Jewish bazaar. So you were part of Middle East society. That is fact. The question now is about foreign policy of your country. Definitely you know recent developments in Kirkuk, blockade in Kurdistan, they banned all international flight to Kurdistan, Hawley and Sulaimaniya, and now Hashd Shabi, PMU, Popular Mobilization units that is copied from Iranian Revolutionary Guard made for Iraq, take over Kirkuk, rich city, and then last night, take the cross-boarding between Iraq and Syria, Rabia, connected, and then Syrian over there, closing to Abu Kamal, cross-boarding over there, and Hashshadi in Iranian side, take cross-border Pakistan. Now they have free flow of military equipment, whatever they want, from Iran, Kermanshah, right through Iraq, Syria, and then Lebanon or Lazikia port in Syria. As a state of Israel, what you gonna do this expansion of Iran and their proxies like Hashishakli, Hezbollah, and Syrian Assad, and what you doing for the only minority that I was struck by your comment that as a minority, Middle East, the other nations, they're gonna tolerate you probably, but not self-determination. We are the same. What you gonna do for your friend, and the most important, there's cutting these roads that connecting Iran to Mediterranean Sea. So why you let Kurdish state, the only democratic, let's say, region over there, to be blockaded, to be threatened, and to be closed in by Hashtishabi, Hezbollah, and other groups. And as a diplomat, if you cannot answer this question, as a scholar, talking about soft power, now Iran tried to legitimize its proxies by Hezbollah defending national interests of Shia in Lebanon, and Hashdi Shadi, Arab nationalism, and defending Iraq unity. American, especially Brett McGurk, the head of coalition in Iraq, calling for unity of Iraq, and right or wrongly deny the self-determination of Kurdish people. We are alone, and we need support in very critical moment of history. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
I just want to clarify some things about your thoughts on the West Bank. I mean, you've talked about how there's no celebrations of Palestinian independence and how authoritarian things are in Gaza and in the West Bank, and the fact that you pulled out of Gaza and went back to the 1967 lines, and that still there's no peace there, and that Palestinians are somehow worse off in their own sovereign states than you would be under Israeli rule. But how can you have a clear, meaningful peace process when the settlements in the West Bank are still endorsed by the Israeli government? They're still happening. I mean, the settlements are growing quite at a huge rate. And regardless of what you think of how the Palestinians are governing themselves or the situation with Hamas, how can you claim to have any kind of commitment to a peace process when you're not respecting the 1967 lines and still continuing to build settlements that are viewed by the vast majority of the international community as illegal?
Elaborate on the question raised by the Iranian Kurd. The Kurdish have determined the destiny for historical one in a referendum on the 25th of September, flying Israeli flags. What are the similarities? What do you think they had in mind with having this? I mean, there are of course historical relationship between the Kurds and Israel. I mean, it traces back to the Shah of Iran in 1950s, 60s. But in what sense can Israel support the Kurdish question today in Iraq, Kurdistan?
I'll try to answer your questions as best I can. I'll start with the issue of settlements. There is a discussion of the issue of settlements that I think is disproportionate. I agree, and we agreed as a government in Oslo, that the issue of the status of the settlements will be resolved in peace talks with the Palestinians, and that's still our position, that the ultimate situation with the settlements will be decided in peace talks. That's the position of the Israeli government. But you get this narrative, which I think is incorrect, that it's all about the settlements. That's the only issue. And so I would ask you once again what I said a moment ago. If it's all about the settlements, why isn't our border with Gaza our most peaceful border? There we took down all the settlements. And I would ask friends of the Palestinians the following question. If you believe Israel should be flexible on the settlement question, can you not question the response of the Palestinian body politic to the only time when Israel, not the only time, but the time when Israel took down settlements? In other words, if you believe Israel should take down settlements, if that's your position. So have what the Palestinians done in Gaza since we took down the settlements, is that likely to encourage us to do it again? Just a question that I think needs to be addressed. The second point that I'd raise is the following. If it's all about the settlements, one has to ask the following question. Why was there no peace before 1967? If it's all about settlements on the West Bank, why was there no peace before 1967? And then we get back to the first point, which is in the eyes of many on the Palestinian side, Tel Aviv is a settlement too. And Haifa is a settlement too. In other words, all Israel is illegitimate. And people in Hamas will tell you straight out, we want a Palestinian state on the West Bank. And if you don't listen, people think, oh, fine, they want peace. They want a... No, but then you listen to the second sentence as a part of a strategy to bring about all of Palestine. And so if people want a Palestinian state just as a vehicle to attack my state from improved lines, they shouldn't be surprised that I'm not going to accept that.
Just that if you don't, well, I don't think anybody's saying that settlement is the only issue, the conflict is much more complicated than that, but if you're then saying that there was no benefit from you stopping settlements in Gaza, then that would lead you to continue to construct these settlements in the West Bank. How do you see that there's any chance for peace then? It just seems that you're saying that you personally and maybe others in the Israeli government don't see that peace is an option. So what do you propose the solution is then? What the Palestinians still have rights, they still have a right to land, they still have issues that need to be dealt with. How can you go forward with any kind of peace process if you're just going to say, well, the Palestinians don't react well to us stopping settlements, but they don't react well to us continuing settlements, so we'll just continue doing it. The Palestinians are still a group of people who have a right to self-determine, they have a right to their own state, they have a right to self-determine just as Israelis do. So what do you propose a solution to it? How do you personally see any kind of resolution going forward?
So I actually think if you look at the core issues to the conflict between us and the Palestinians, and I think in Oslo, if you read the agreements, it's actually written out. There's issues of final borders, there's the issue of Jerusalem, there's the issue of refugees, there's the issue of settlements. In many ways, the solution to the issue of settlements has been put out there in all sorts of ways. And I'm not talking about unilateral Israeli peace plans, I'm talking about plans that actually were, many cases were not accepted by my government. But there's, if you look at the Clinton parameters, or the Geneva Agreement, or the Beilin Abu Mazen document, or the Sari Nusayba Ami Ayalon document, the way they deal with the settlements, there are differences between the different peace plans, but all of them have the same principal solution, which is the large settlement blocks are incorporated into Israel, the Palestinians receive a trade-off, and that way you solve most of the problems because most of the settlers are in the large settlement blocks. And then you have the question, what do you do with those communities that are going to be on the Palestinian side of the border? And that's a difficult question. But I want to raise, in response to that difficult question, a question that I think needs to be addressed. If we're talking about peace, if we're talking about reconciliation, and that's a prerequisite, you're not going to get an Israeli withdrawal without that, correct? So if Israel can have an Arab minority, why is it presumed how do you say this in Latin? A priori?
A priori.
A priori, that you couldn't have a Jewish minority in a Palestinian state. Now, without going into where the borders would be between Israel and Palestine, that has to be negotiated in peace. But you've had a Jewish community, let's say in the city of Hebron, since time immemorial. Why is it presumed that if you're ever going to have peace, all the Jews have to leave? Once again, Israel has an Arab minority. Why couldn't a future Palestine have a Jewish community? Is that not another way of trying to solve the issue? Just to think about. On the issue of Kurds, you are right, and the professor is right, that there has been a historic friendship between Jews and Kurds. And I know there's a large Jewish Kurdish community that immigrated from Kurdistan to Israel, and they have very strong and friendly and fond memories of the Kurdish people and Kurdish customs. They're very proud of the Kurdish-Jewish relationship. And in the last generation, there have been all sorts of contacts, which we don't discuss publicly often, between Israel and Kurds. It's also based on, there are common interests, but it's also based on a fundamental thing, is that we are both minority communities in the Middle East, correct? And an understanding that in a region which is predominantly an Arab majority, that Jews and Kurds are minority groups that are both intrinsic to the region, have been there for, and have a right to exist. About the current crisis, I probably can't say everything you would like me to say, but the Israeli government, I think, is the only Western government that has publicly come out and expressed solidarity with the national aspirations of the Kurdish people. It might not be enough from your perspective, but it's more than anyone else. All right? On your question about Zionism.
Can we have move on? Because I'm more concerned about lobbying. How Israeli lobby doing enough, especially Washington, to ease this blockade and to just ease the Washington state about Kurdistan, about Iraqi unity.
I understand the question, and you have to understand, you're asking me what is Israel doing today behind the scenes in our diplomatic contacts. And you will understand that I cannot talk about that sort of thing. I apologize. As to your question about Zionism, what is Zionism? Zionism is the movement of my people for national self-determination. That's all it is. So if you say to me, stop being a Zionist, you're saying you don't want to be a free people in your own sovereign state anymore. So of course I'm not going to give up on Zionism. Does that mean that I have a specific demand or position on different aspects of how we solve the problem with our neighbors? No. But that I want to be a free people, independent, national self-determination, that I will never give up on. Now, if that's a bridge too far for our neighbors, we won't have peace. If our neighbors can stand up and say, we want to live in peace with the Jewish state, then everything is possible. I spoke before about peace between Israel and Egypt. You know, Israel and Egypt fought more people were killed in the Israeli-Egyptian wars than in any other part of the conflict with us and our neighbors. We had a very difficult war in 1948-49. We had another war with Egypt in 56. We had another war with Egypt in 67. We had another war with Egypt in 73. During those conflicts, too many people were killed on both sides. The minute President Sadat came to Israel, and this November is the 40th anniversary, and said, no more war, let's solve our problems through negotiations. We had difficult negotiations, we've had ups and downs, but there has been no more war, because the basic prerequisite would be you accept our right to exist, and then everything else can fall into place. A few months ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu invited President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority to address the Knesset. And in the same sentence he said, if you invite me to Ramallah, I'm happy to address the Palestinian parliament. The way Sadat came to the Knesset. Abbas decided he didn't want to take up the invitation and he didn't want to invite Netanyahu. But I believe, and I said this in the answer to the first question, I believe that's the core of the conflict. If President Abbas went before the Knesset and a whole list of paper of all the Palestinian demands, right? And he says, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And then he said, and if you do all that, we accept the Jewish people that they have a right to national self-determination in their homeland. Not all the homeland, in part of their homeland. Right? We accept them as brothers and sisters who are intrinsic to our region. The Quran talks about Jews in the Middle East. You've been our neighbors for years. You will continue to be our neighbors. In other words, a message of peace and reconciliation. It would change everything. Unfortunately, and I'm not talking about the Hamas extremists, today, what is the language that the PA, Fatah, the Palestinian leadership, what is the language they use when they talk about us? I said before, we are colonialists, we are imperialists, we are apartheid, we are fascists, we are militarists. If we're all of those things, which we're not, but if in their eyes we're all those things, that means we're illegitimate and we should be, Israel is like the Belgians in the Congo, or we're like the British in India, we're like the French in Indochina. If that's the way our neighbors perceive us, you're not going to have peace, because they're saying there shouldn't be an Israel. The fundamental core to the conflict is recognition of the legitimacy of my country. And when our neighbors can cross that Rubicon, I believe peace becomes infinitely doable. That's my position.
Thank you, Mark. We've come to the end of our afternoon. I'm sure there are many more questions floating around, many more discussions that we can have. We've got something to think about. I don't think it's an easy job being the ambassador of Israel. I think you've got a tough one there, but I think we all appreciate you coming to Leeds today and to having a frank discussion with us. And I personally would like to thank you for a very interesting afternoon.